Hi, good morning. Welcome to the New York State Political Science Association meetings, panels for undergraduate students. We have a great selection of papers today that focus on international politics. My name is Keith Preble. I'm a PhD candidate at the University at Albany, SUNY. I study foreign policy as well as international relations more broadly, experience teaching terrorism and counterterrorism here at UAlbany, as well as US foreign policy and US politics. So the good thing is that everybody's paper sort of fell into an area either where I do research or where I've, at least where I've taught. So hopefully a lot of the feedback, I can give some really good feedback today on your papers as you hopefully develop them into future projects. So we have 5 students today from various universities in New York State. I'll allow them to do their introductions at the start of each of their presentations. So I'll have Gabriel begin with his presentation. So I will turn it over to him. Before he begins, if anyone has questions during any of the presentations, please feel free to leave your question in the chat box. After the conclusion of the presentations, I'll provide remarks as discussant to each of the panelists. And then after my remarks, if there are any questions from those participating or those in the audience, please do not hesitate to ask. So with that being said, Gabriel, why don't you begin?
Okay, thank you a lot. First, my name is Gabriel Henrique Alves, or Gabriel Henrique Alves in Portuguese. I'm 23 years old, I'm Brazilian. I'm a student of international relations at the University of Lisbon. I started my graduation in Brazil, then 3 years and a half, I decided to move to Lisbon. I'm a senior, almost 2 months from graduation. First, I would like to thank the New York State Political Science Association for having me. It's such an amazing opportunity. It's my first time in a call for papers, and I'm feeling really honored. And second, my mentor, Pedro Borges Graça, he's here today. He was my mentor for this article. And Teresa de Almeida Silva, which is the coordinator of my course, she's also here. And finally, my friends from Brazil and Portugal and my family that are supporting me today. I'm going to start to share the presentation. So here we have the geography of hunger and refugee security dilemmas. I decided to discuss about this topic since last year, 1 billion people in the world was suffering from starvation and 2 billion people from food insecurity. I'm going to explain these both concepts after. But here, first, what I want to share with you guys is the United Nations Security Council resolution of 2020, which regards the idea of the link between hunger and armed conflict. It's a vicious circle. War and conflict can cause food insecurity and hunger, just as hunger and food insecurity can cause latent conflicts to flare up and trigger the use of violence. This is because we live in a paradox between safety and security. Mostly, we live in countries and the states and the countries can protect us. But in the case, for example, for refugees, they don't have anyone to protect them. So the first question that I have here made by Buzan, which is one of the authors that I used here, is who can do security on whose behalf? If you're not under a supervision of a state, who is going to protect you? Who is going to protect these refugees? What is the meaning for security and safety? Who is going to bring safety for the people that became landless? Landless in the meaning of displaced people. And all these topics made my started question, which is how does the geography of hunger in terms of food insecurity reverberate on refugees, security dilemma in order to intensify the migratory crisis and the war for survival. So here I want to elucidate the geography of hunger, which I used Josué de Castro, it is the father of the geography of hunger. He wrote this book in 1964 regarding the hunger in Brazil and how this affects the world entirely. So we have 4 pillars here, and the first one is the food security. For food security, according to the World Food Programs, we have 4 pillars. First is the availability. The availability regards, for example, if you have a place that you can buy this food, is the food is available in your city, in your camp, or something like that. Second, the access. If this cheap or not, if it's easy to get this food or to travel to get this food. Also, the dimension of utilization, which is really interesting to think that today we have 13 people in the world suffering from obesity, and another side, 8.9% of the world population suffering from starvation. So here we have food, and one side we have food, but not good food, and the other side we have the lack of food. And the last is the stability, which is the World Food Program regards the idea of food all times. For example, in case of a refugee, for this refugee doesn't have to fear or to think the fear of the lack of food. For example, because they had food yesterday, they have tomorrow, they have today, they are going to have tomorrow. And lately we have here the food insecurity. In the absence of one of these 4 pillars, we have food insecurity. And according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Article 25, everyone has the right to food. So if these people, they're facing starvation, there is a problem with the protocols that many countries assigned it. So here we have starvation and acute food, which is the difference between both of them. The starvation is the last stage of hunger before death in this case. And acute food is the absence of food, but in low levels or high levels of food insecurity. And malnourishment, it's regards the idea of the lack of nutrients in a meal, because if you have this meal, we need the nutrients for our body to survive. And here, according to Josué de Castro, when you have 50% of the population or a group or a tribe or a country that are facing hunger, this creates hunger areas because they are defined as dietary deficiencies. So here, this can create endemic hunger, famine epidemic, and the idea of vital space by Hatzel, which is as human beings, we have a relation with the soil, with the culture, with the language. But if you need to survive in the case of the lack of food, we need to abdicate of this part of our life. And lately, we have the violence. It's not defined by Josué de Castro, but Galtin explained the idea of violence. We have 3 types of violence: potential, action, and direct violence. The potential, it's something that could be avoidable, but it wasn't. The actual, for example, in case of hunger or wars or something like that, and the direct violence that it's directly linked to wars and conflict and people that are dying in conflicts and something like that. Also, what I want to point here, for example, last century, we didn't have the cure for many diseases. So there isn't a violence because we didn't have the information, we didn't have the technology. But now if someone has a type of cancer that there is a cure, but the health system it's not helping, it's a kind of violence. And in the absence of food insecurity, it creates the food insecurity that creates the hunger areas, and this is a type of violence, which the collateral damage is the humanitarian crisis. I want to share with you this map of the acute food insecurity. We can see here that mostly in Central Africa and in the Middle East, and also in Central America, that most of the countries that has acute food, they also have problems with conflicts or economy, social or cultural weakness. So here the lack of food is related to poverty. According to the World Food Program and FAO, in 2019 was the number of 272 million refugees, which from this number, 45.7 million displaced due conflicts and 5.1 due natural disasters. And 4 of 5 these refugees are facing food insecurity. 9 of 10 is starvation, which is high numbers for refugee, because if the refugees, they are in a camp, this doesn't seem that they are protected or having a good life. And according to FAO, the WFPO, the UN Agency for Refugees, for countries, for example, in Ethiopia or South Sudan, they are facing starvation because of the reduction of financing for this organization to 10 to 30%. So normally a refugee has 3 to 4 meals a day, but because of this reduction, they're having 1 to 2 meals a day. And here I want to share another graphic from the World Food Program related to the numbers of undernourished people. Here in 2019, we have 8.9% of the world population suffering from starvation. And we are really close to 2005. So we are close to the Sustainable Development Goals until 2030, but we are far away from achieving this because we are comebacking for the first stage. And also this map about hunger map from the World Food Program, which is, they have a report that are doing a prediction that in 2030, they're going to have 840 million people passing hunger in the world. And what it's really interesting to think, for example, in Africa, if you see like the maps for Africa with COVID and food insecurity as well, there's many countries here that we don't have any information about the situation, as well as in Asia, as well as in South America. And this is a really important thing that we need to discuss. So finally, what I wanted to share with you guys today is that lack of food can cause conflict. And I wrote this quote that is, the refugee who have survived should not be told as hero histories by the media. There is no heroism in being a refugee, but an attempt for survival. So I saw many news or many newspapers telling histories about these refugees, like if they are heroes or okay, they can handle something like that, but it's not. It's a decide that they made for survival. And here sometimes we have a problem between illegal refugees and legal refugees. But how we can define them if they're running from food insecurity, from conflict, from religious persecution? And starting from my first question of research, which is how the geography of hunger reverberates under refugee dilemma. Is this because if you don't have food, you're going to create an unprotectable scenario. And as explained by the World Food Program, until 2030, it's going to be unsustainable for these organizations to hold all these refugees by themselves. And we know that we are living in a world that we are facing the high of nationalism and isolationism, and these refugees need us. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any doubts or any questions that you want to share with me, feel free to make. And that is, thank you for watching. I'm going to stop the presentation. Should I have to stop, Keith, or can I continue with the presentation?
No, you can stop here and we'll go on to the next presenter. Great job. I look forward to talking more with you about your project. Very good.
Thanks a lot.
Jessica, do you want to turn on your camera and activate your share your presentation? You can begin whenever you're ready, Jessica.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was unmuted.
Yeah, no worries.
My name is Jessica Gibbrey. I'm from Rhode Island and I attend Quinnipiac University. My major is Law and Society and my minor is Criminal Justice. I'm currently in year 3 of the 3+3 accelerated law program at Quinnipiac University, so I will be attending Quinnipiac School of Law in the fall. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to be presenting to you my senior thesis. It's called A Legislative Failure, Courts Must Step In to Fight the Climate Crisis. So my research question starting out was, how can the judicial branch aid in the movement to stop climate change? So first, I'm going to give you some background on climate change and current US climate protections. Then I'm going to talk about some lawsuits that have been filed to gain relief from climate change. And I'm going to discuss some barriers that these cases are facing in the court system. So what is climate change and why do we care about it? So the United States is responsible for 25% of all historical emissions of carbon dioxide. And when carbon dioxide gets trapped in the atmosphere, it's causing global temperatures to rise, which is resulting in extreme weather such as wildfires, flooding, famine, disease, flood, drought, and at least 3 million lives can be saved every single year just by rapidly phasing out the fossil fuel industry and replacing it with clean, renewable energy. Unfortunately, the United States is not being responsive to this issue of climate change, Internationally, the last administration withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which is a global effort to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Fortunately, President Biden has re-entered the US into this agreement, but that doesn't mean that we're going to stay in it going forward and through changes in the next administrations. Domestically, the Clean Air Act is the toughest regulation on emissions. However, the standards that it sets are set by the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a product of the political branches. So the standards are vulnerable to political swaying, and clearly they are not strict enough if the United States is still emitting the most carbon dioxide emissions per capita in the world. So citizens, environmental organizations, and states are desperate to gain relief from climate change. So they've been filing lawsuits for decades trying to gain relief. They've come up with many creative claims just because people are so desperate to gain relief. But I'm going to focus on constitutional claims, the public trust doctrine, and common law public nuisance claims. So first, under constitutional claims, we have due process and the Ninth Amendment. Due process says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or happiness without due process of the law. And the Ninth Amendment grants the people of the United States rights that are not enumerated in the Constitution. So the right to a healthy environment has actually been proposed as an amendment to the Constitution 3 times in Congress, in 1968, in 1970, and again in 2003. Unfortunately, it failed to pass each time. In 1971, in the case Environmental Defense Fund versus the Corps of Engineers, plaintiffs brought the suit claiming that they had the right to a healthy environment. And the court in this case said that they did not find this right in 1971, but they provided this strong dicta that this right could be found in the future. In Roe versus Wade and Obergefell versus Hodges, these are just 2 examples of courts granting unenumerated rights when they granted the right to same-sex marriage and the right to abortion. Now we have this case that was recently in court. It was filed in 2018, Juliana versus United States. There are 27 youth plaintiffs, and they're suing under the idea that they have the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life. And the district court in this case actually said that we do have this right because it's inherent to carry out our other listed rights that are life, liberty, and happiness. So 50 years later, the court cannot deny that we have this right. They can't afford to wait until the next case, as they have been doing for the last 50 years, because climate change has become such an imminent threat beyond what we could have imagined in 1971. Even if the court does not find that we have a right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life, the US government is still violating the Equal Protection Clause that is embedded in the Fifth Amendment. The plaintiffs in Juliana are claiming that they're a protected class because they are children, and they're saying that their young generation is not being afforded the same environmental protections as previous generations because they are not going to have the same climate and the same environment that previous generations had. And even if the court does not find that there was a violation of the Constitution under the Fifth Amendment and the Ninth Amendment, they're still violating the public trust doctrine, which is the idea that the federal government has a legal duty to manage the nation's natural resources so that current and future generations can benefit from them. Unfortunately, due to climate change, natural resources are being diminished and future generations are not going to be able to enjoy them. Juliana claims that the climate is the overarching resource that must be protected and managed in order to protect the resources of air, land, and water. So the government has a duty to manage the climate in a way that's going to preserve the resources, which they are not doing now. And if all of the constitutional claims fail and the public trust doctrine violation fails in court, climate change is still a public nuisance. A public nuisance is an unreasonable interference with a right common to the general public. In 2011, a bunch of states tried to file suit against oil companies, claiming that it was a public nuisance to cause climate change. And the court held that states could not bring federal nuisance claims, but they could bring state claims. So that's why this case failed, because they brought it in federal court. So now in 2019, Rhode Island filed suit in Rhode Island State Court. They brought claims against fossil fuel companies for substantially contributing to climate change with their greenhouse gas emissions. The fossil fuel companies knew about the consequences of fossil fuels decades ago, and they refused to switch to renewable energy. And as a result, climate change is damaging the state's infrastructure and coastal communities because it's causing sea level to rise at 4 times the global average in Rhode Island. So if we go back to the definition of public nuisance, the fossil fuel companies were being unreasonable because they knew decades ago what the fossil fuels would do to the environment, and they refused to switch, and is interfering with the right of Rhode Island to use its infrastructure. Unfortunately, there are some barriers in the legal system for cases to sue for climate relief. The first issue is standing. Standing is a particularized injury that is fairly traceable to the defendant's actions, and the injury has to be redressable in court. Massachusetts versus EPA said that states have a special kind of standing. So fortunately, when states file suit, like in the Rhode Island case, they can bypass the standing obstacle. In Juliana, some of the plaintiffs are experiencing flooding in their homes, some are experiencing starvation due to climate change. So the court held that they did have particularized injury in that case. The court also held that it was fairly traceable to the defendant's actions because the United States is responsible for such a significant amount of emissions. The court did hold that the plaintiff satisfied the first 2 elements of standing. Redressability, unfortunately, was the downfall of Juliana. In the appellate court, the court held that the plaintiff's injuries were not redressable because just ordering the government to draw down excess greenhouse gas emissions was not going to fix their injuries. But the district court held that it would. And should this case go to the Supreme Court, I think that the Supreme Court should look more closely at how the district court ruled and why they believe that this would redress their injuries by preventing them from getting worse. The next obstacle is the political questions doctrine, which decides who gets to hear the merits of the case. Is it the political branches or is it the judicial branch? And ultimately in the Juliana case, the court said that because it comes down to a question of constitutional rights, the courts may hear the case. And then the last obstacle is that the courts are very reluctant to make policy. However, they have in other cases such as Roe versus Wade, Nabergefell versus Hodges, and Brown versus Board of Education. So courts have done it in the past when it was necessary, and I think that it's most definitely necessary for them to do it again now. Also to that, I have a quote from federal appellate judge Howard J. Woodford, and he said, "Waiting for the legislator is not productive. The legislator doesn't legislate. Courts have had to do a great deal of stuff that would be better for the legislator to have done, but it's better for the courts to do them than no one." So in conclusion, the judicial branch must order the federal government to draw down excess greenhouse gas emissions because it's a violation of the inherent right to a sustainable environment. It's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment. It's a violation of the public trust doctrine, and it's a violation of common law public nuisance.
Thank you, Jessica. Nice job. And then we'll move on to Javier. Just don't forget to unmute yourself when you're ready.
Apologies for the delay. Alrighty. Awesome. So I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. No one can hear me. Alrighty, we're good to go. Good afternoon and good morning. My name is Javier Antonio Fernandez. I'm currently a junior at the United States Military Academy here at West Point, New York. And today I'll be talking to you about the Christian identity movement and the extent to which it can resemble as a potential case study of insurgency. Going over the agenda real quick, first, I will be going over the importance of differentiating and as well as conceptualizing what insurgency is, as well as the specific framework that I have used in my studies in order to help condense the complexities of what insurgency is and how it's been conceptualized over the past 20 plus years. Also, what and why the Christian identity movement, why it's important to look at the identity movement as a potential case study of insurgency within the United States. Then going over a quick overview of how I applied and how I have assessed the movement in accordance to the framework that I have used. And of course, a general overview of discussion limitations and potential ways forward. So without further ado, disclaimer, it's important to note that as a student at the United States Military Academy, I am active duty. So it is my legal responsibility to highlight that the views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not reflect those of the United States Military Academy, the Department of the United States Army, and the United States government. Going over, already, conceptualizing and differentiating insurgency warfare from other forms of political violence. As seen with the quote that I have there from Seth Jones' Waging Insurgent Warfare, insurgency can be defined as a protracted political military struggle directed towards subverting or displacing the legitimacy of a constituted government, or an occupying power, by completely or partially controlling the resources of a territory using irregular military forces and political institutions. A key thing to understand insurgency and other forms of political violence, such as terrorism, guerrilla warfare, and more conventional forms of warfare, is that each one of those strategies is a specific directed form of violence. People engaged in terrorism are often focused on attacking non-combatants and civilian infrastructures in order to coerce a government in order to institute some form of policy. And often tacked onto that to inflict a distinct psychological impact in order to instill fear. Guerrilla warfare is mainly characterized by hit and run attacks against military and police installations. And of course, conventional warfare, I'm sure we're all familiar with conventional forms of warfare, i.e. distinct military units engaging in decisive attacks in order to completely destroy or capture distinct government resources. Insurgency, on the other hand, has been often conceptualized as an alternative form of state building, and over the years has been condensed down into a synergistic product of will, means, and opportunity. The will encompasses the specific frames and narratives that provide context and direction for insurgent grievances and ideology, simply what they believe and how they believe it. The means simply encompass the material and non-material assets, the organizational infrastructures, the specific strategies, operational methods that are necessary for sustaining the movement and for achieving its goals. Simply the organizational and operational infrastructure of the insurgency. And finally, opportunities. For those of you who are familiar with social movement theory, opportunities are simply those enabling mechanisms that are inherent within the socio-political environment of a state that allow the movement to progress, that allow it to take advantage of distinct openings within the system in order to advance its claims and further advance its activities in pursuit of its goals. Now, finally, what and why is the Christian identity movement? At its core, the Christian identity movement is an American extension of the British Israelite movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and ultimately believes in a racialized fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible that inevitably seeks the establishment of a totalitarian white ethno-theocracy. Like other groups throughout history, the Christian identity movement is layered in the sense that it has had groups and still has groups that are organic to the movement, i.e. those specific pastoral communities that actively espouse identity doctrine, and inorganic to the movement, those various groups and affiliates that have had either explicit connections to identity or distinct ideological connections, where one actor may have said, yes, I am identity, but the entire group itself may not necessarily represent the identity movement in and of itself. And of course, beyond the academic precedents established by the various works below, for discussing specific far-right extremist groups, not exclusively the identity movement as a potential case study of insurgency, as in insurgency and terrorism, insurgents and supremacists, and to a very limited extent, Religion and the Racist Strife by Michael Barkun. And or the necessity to consider counterinsurgency approaches Additional reasons for looking at the movement as Ari Perliger highlights in American Zealots is the extensiveness to which the identity movement has inserted itself within the American far right as a key ideological pillar for anti-federalists to white nationalists and supremacist groups alike. And of course, throughout history, the movement has served as indeed a source of inspiration for numerous groups. And over the years, the dynamic has allowed for a cross-pollination of identity and non-identity ideas, kind of fusing into a big jumbled mesh of overlapping belief systems. Going over, but what are the distinct belief systems that are very characteristic of the identity movement? Overall, again, the Christian identity movement's designation as a potential case study of insurgency is supported by its general desire to replace the current American political order with a totalitarian white ethnocentric theocracy, something more conducive for the white Christian Protestant individual. Key to identity theology is their ardent anti-Semitism, where they believe that there is a global Jewish cabal that is seeking to gain dominancy in global financial and political arenas in order to promote the destruction and decomposition of what they perceive as the Aryan race. Their subsequent motivations to displace Their subsequent motivations to replace the federal government with a totalitarian theocracy are also informed by their Christian Reconstructionist and Dominionist underpinnings, which at their core simply advocate for the institution of biblical law and the subjugation of all non-Christians, racial and ethnic minorities, and women under a white patriarchy, specifically as referred to in the more Old Testament literature within the Bible. Finally, the Christian identity movement's aspirations for establishing a white ethno-state are informed by their fears regarding the potential extinction of the Aryan race through interracial relations with non-Aryan peoples. Adherents believe that the reestablishment of white Christian sovereignty within the United States requires the use of organized aggression, albeit variably in how that is actually materialized or should materialize, to combat the further enfranchisement of those social groups believed to be inherently inferior by their specific beliefs. And of course, sympathy generated along situated of the peripheries has helped the movement's belief systems, at the very least, its more tempered versions, to be welcomed or at least exist within the more mainstream parts of the right-wing political discourse. But that being said, those specific individuals within that demographic do not exclusively believe nor do exclusively support the institution of what Christian identity actually seeks to achieve. Moving on to the specific means of the Christian identity movement. In his book, Religion and the Racist Right, Michael Barkun identifies 6 distinct forms of political activity that the identity movement and its adherents along the far right have used in order to advance their specific claims and move towards achieving their specific goals. I've condensed those 6 into the 3 that you see here on the slide. First being conjuring moral and political support among identity sympathizers for building campaigns that inevitably lead to the biblicization of American law. This more condensed interpretation of the first 2 methods has arguably provided identity in other far-right extremist groups with more political and cultural camouflage necessary to achieve their goals without pursuing more conventional means of insurgency, i.e. explicit forms of terrorism and guerrilla operations in active armed conflict against the state. And throughout the latter half of the 20th century, there have been several attempts made by identity adherents, namely inorganic to the movement, to secure positions in elected office, both at the state and federal levels. Key examples include David Duke, one of the leaders of the KKK, and Pat Buchanan. The Christian identity movement's variable deference to survivalism and radical localism, as highlighted by the second bullet here, establishing paramilitary survivalist communities in preparation for the collapse of the federal government and the end times that follow, has embodied a crucial limitation to their designation as a potential case study of insurgency, simply because a lot of survivalist communities actually never seek to proactively destabilize the state. And indeed, as Michael Barkun highlights, in theory and often in practice, survivalists desire no real core with the existing political order and really only desire to be left alone. And of course, despite their insistence and preparations, such groups have also failed to establish any distinct form of political or territorial control over group specified regions, only seeing the necessity to take over distinct territories upon the perceived collapse of the federal government. The last two methods, as highlighted here, planned terrorist and guerrilla operations to combat state and federal law enforcement to forcibly establish a white ethno-state through political revolution, have also had variable acceptance amongst the identity movement in and of itself. Contemporary assessments have highlighted the identity's ties to the militia movement, specifically their first wave, in the movement's inspiration in the October 1992 Estes Park meeting between identity adherents, white nationalists, and anti-federalists. And their further inspiration, the more millenarian, finally said that word right, the millenarian sects of the militia movement, or the Christian patriot movement as it's often referred to, as the extent of the movement's proactivity towards achieving their desired end state via more typical means of insurgency, i.e. terrorist and guerrilla operations and through armed conflict against the state. In terms of organizational structure, in keeping with the principles of decentralized or leaderless resistance, as highlighted by Louis Beam, which is one of the formidable leaders within the far right, collaboration between identity, their affiliates, and other extremist groups has remained at a minimum insofar as to allow individuals and groups their independence, as well as to preserve the movement's overall security from infiltrators. For proponents on the far right, this came as the overwhelming militarization and armament of the state discounted a really purely guerrilla warfare strategy. The strength of the government inevitably made active armed conflict and insurrection nearly impossible. So they diverted to more decentralized means of organizing and collaboration in order to undermine the legitimacy of the federal and state governments. And overall, throughout the movement's development since its inception, while they have certainly demonstrated the capacity and desire for insurgent activity, they have nevertheless failed to develop to a level of sophistication as indicative of open conflict as we've seen in the past in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in the Middle East. They, at the very minimum, resemble the incipient level of insurgency, the beginnings where simple organizational mechanisms and operational infrastructures are still under development in order to prepare for something more advanced down the road. And finally, the distinct socio-historical opportunities that have enabled the movement's growth. This is inevitably complex, and there are a lot of literature out there that more thoroughly explain it than I ever could within the time that we have. But overall, to give you guys just a general overview, the general lack of consistency to which the identity movement has been able to both capitalize and engineer favorable political conditions for its continued development has long challenged its ability to develop to more advanced stages of insurgency. Indeed, their further inability to maintain a sufficiently consistent degree of moral and political support, especially in relatively unfavorable political environments, has inevitably challenged their ability to progress, inevitably to proactively develop their movement independent of the structure, the political structure that is.
Just to let you know, you just have 2 minutes left.
Awesome, thank you. To develop independently from the political infrastructure as a proactive movement in order to establish their own desired form of government. And finally, going over the discussion limitations and potential ways forward, this project was inherently limited by the oversimplification of a lot of intra-movement ties, of a lot of historical processes that have enabled the movement, and has also failed to add a distinct quantitative analysis, which is, in my opinion, inevitably important for quantifying the movement's proactivity and comparing that to other groups that we've seen in the past, as well as a distinct mention of radicalization and recruitment, which for those of us who are familiar with counterterrorism literature is absolutely essential for developing viable programs to help reduce the propensity for extremism, excuse me. And with that, that concludes my presentation. My contact information is below. Thank you for listening.
Great job. Thank you very much. Dorian, you're up next.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to share my screen with you all. Okay, wonderful. Can everyone see the presentation? I believe, and I believe I'm unmuted as well.
Yeah, you're
Okay.
good to go.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Dorian Provencher. I am an undergraduate student, a junior at Marymount Manhattan College. I study international studies and politics and human rights. My specific research interests lie in the fields of international law and human rights and the intersections between the two. Today I'm going to be talking about African and Western states' approaches to human rights, a theoretical analysis of state behavior, and the Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review. The overview of my presentation is going to simply be a brief history into what the Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review is, following my methods for collecting my research and the two theoretical lenses that I'm going to use to analyze my findings, which are the realist perspective and the constructivist perspective. Finally, I'm going to present my findings, give my analysis and my conclusion, and also offer a way for future research and future questions that I have. This was a term paper, so I definitely plan on continuing to do research after this conference. So any feedback that you all would give would be tremendously helpful. So let's jump right into it. The Human Rights Council was established in 2006. Its predecessor was the Commission on Human Rights, was created right after World War II. And after World War II, what we see is an increase and an emphasis on the rights of the individual. There are a multitude of human rights treaties that are passed against prohibiting racial discrimination, rights of the women, rights of child, conventions against torture, so on and so forth, that really promote this idea of a centralization of human rights in international legal doctrine. And despite this kind of centrality of human rights to international organizations such as the UN, one thing that I found in my preliminary research is that state behavior on human rights and in dialogue about human rights varies very differently. So my question was, what accounts for this variation? And to do so, I'm going to look at the Universal Periodic Review, which is a mechanism of the Human Rights Council. The Universal Periodic Review is the only mechanism in the world that sees 100% participation from all UN member states engaging in a conversation around human rights. Each Universal Periodic Review has a working group, and I believe right now we're about to finish the third cycle. I could be wrong on that, but my research is really looking at the first two cycles to look at how states engaged with each other. And each working group breaks down as follows. First is a presentation of the state's reports of their human rights conditions by the reviewed state. And then it goes into an interactive dialogue between the reviewing states and the reviewed states on inquiries, recommendations, congratulations, things like that. And finally, the working group reports concludes with recommendations given to states on what they could do better for their human rights. And I believe it's a very high number of recommendations that are accepted, maybe like 75, if I remember correctly. The reason why I chose the Universal Periodic Review is because it is the one place that we can see a 100% participation from all UN member states. And I thought it'd be ideal to review how states are engaging with each other. I think it's important to realize that for my research, instead of really looking at the effects of how this dialogue of human rights impacts like human rights progression, human rights in the country, I'm really trying to explain the behavior of the reviewing states, of the states that are giving commentary on the reviewed states. So again, despite the centrality of human rights in the global community, states' behavior in the UPR reports considerably varies. Why is that? What accounts for this variation? So my methodology. What I did is I chose two reviewed countries and case studies to see what was going on. I chose Ghana and South Africa based on their similar democratic ranking in the Freedom House reports of both 2008 and 2012, which are the 2 years of the UPR cycles, and also their close geographic proximity. Although they're distance apart, they are in the same region. I thought keeping the two countries that I was going to conduct case studies in would be ideal to try to minimize as many variables as possible. And what I do whenever I went to start to quantify some of the things that were being said is I take a research method from Edward McMahon in Universal Periodic Review, A Work in Progress. He lays out this idea of categorizing each and every one of the recommendations based off of some of the language. I use McMahon's research as a baseline for what I wanted to do, but I also expand and add onto it, creating 3 general categorizations for my research. One being hard recommendations, which are going to be recommendations with more formal language, saying things like you need to adopt, you need to ratify, you need to establish, you need to take measures, more like strict, such that. So for McMahon, these would translate to the C4 or C5 category. Soft recommendations, which are really just we would like you to give more information. We'd like you to reflect. We would like you to consider. We would like you to maintain, things like that, not as strict as the former recommendations as I described. In the McMahon's research methods, these would fall under the categories of C1, C2, and C3. I have grouped those together and I'm calling those soft recommendations. And then finally, one thing that I really think separates my work from McMahon's is he doesn't really consider statements, but it is a very large part of the working group report. And I think it is very important to consider those as well, especially because it is a socialization of states around this idea of human rights. And the UPR is a great place to kind of observe states in an interactive dialogue with each other around human rights. So I thought it's important to take advantage of that and not just focus on the soft and hard recommendations. So the 2 types of analytical perspectives I use in my research are the realist perspective and the constructivist perspective. Now, one thing that has actually been a big critique of my paper that I've heard is not including the liberal perspective, which is another a mainstream international theoretical lens, international relations theoretical lens. I simply could not put this in this research because of time restraints. But like I said, I mentioned before, I do want to take this research further and include the liberal perspective. I chose these 2 simply because I think it really shows a contrast in explaining state behavior, one being the power dynamics, states' interest, for a realist, and then for a constructivist perspective, really looking at the norms. And I thought the constructivist perspective was a really interesting take on the situation because we are really seeing these socializations between states, which I think really emphasizes the inherent normalization of human rights that is embedded within this process of the Universal Periodic Review. So I'm going to be looking at the 2008 and 2012 reports for both Ghana and South Africa. I quantify state behavior, and then I'm going to provide analysis of how states have changed their behavior between the 2 reports, and also how the states are behaving. I'm really looking to see which one of these theoretical lenses provides the best explanation. Obviously, there are a multitude of theoretical lenses I could have used, but these are the ones I used for the purposes of my research paper. And further research could allow me to look more into other theoretical perspectives. So my data and findings. What we see here, let's look at the Ghana case study, which I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it is the top figures 1 and 2. And what we see here, especially in 2008, for both Ghana and South Africa, is that African states aren't really giving that many recommendations. And even when they do give recommendations, they're not giving hard recommendations, which again would fall under the C4 and C5 category. But rather, what African states are choosing to do here is generally using softer recommendations and statements. And what we see in the 2012 report is we see a significant increase. We see that, especially in the case study of Ghana in 2012, African states are more willing to use harder recommendations, but there's still there's a significant growth and increase in participation overall, both hard recommendations, soft recommendations, and the statements. Altogether, there is an increase in participation from African states. So what accounts for this behavior? I think a realist perspective is going to highlight the power dynamics. Although in another conference that I had, someone even asked me if a realist would even consider human rights like worth, participating in. Is that an authentic analytical lens to preserve to analyze the situation? And I think it is, because I think it highlights the power dynamics between states in their pursuit of trying to lead power and seeing these international institutions as an extension of their power, right? So one way to view this is we can see, and one can make the argument that Western states do put a lot of hard recommendations in the 2008 report, which was the first cycle. So the argument could be made from a realist perspective that the pressure put on African states by their Western counterparts is what leads to their increase in participation in the 2012 report. I think that is a very sound argument, and I think it holds through in both cases. We see the same with South Africa in 2008, in which African states' participation in the first cycle is less than what they're doing in the 2012 cycle. And I think the argument is, it's sound, it's logical. I have no problem with it. I think it's a great way to analyze the situation, and it definitely highlights the power dynamics between the region. I mean, after all, the United Nations Security Council, 4 of the members are Western. The 4 of the 5 permanent members are Western states. So there definitely is this power dynamic that is really important to discuss. But I prefer using a constructivist approach because I think that it does explain the growth, but I think the realist perspective really fails to explain the behavior of how African states are participating in both the 2008 report and the 2012 report. In both, we see a softer approach to human rights, which is something that came to my attention in the literature of the UPR and in state participation in the UPR. Specifically, these 2 articles were talking about how African states typically use softer approaches to human rights rather than like naming and shaming and harder approaches that Western states takes to human rights. So that finding was not surprising, but I think that the constructivist perspective is better at explaining the situation, because what we're seeing here in both the statements, in the hard recommendations and the soft recommendations, is a socialization around a human rights dialogue. It inevitably bolsters the norm of human rights and puts pressure on states to participate in future cycles. And also, I think that African states' preference of using soft recommendations can best be explained through this constructivist perspective as well. It's not a normalization of human rights inherently, but a normalization on human rights enforcement mechanisms. And that's
just
where
to
I
let you
think
know, you have 2 minutes, just to let you know.
Thank you so much. So I think we see this dichotomy in which while Western states are normalizing using harder recommendations, we see African states normalizing using softer recommendations and statements and focusing on this like this socialization around human rights rather than a harder, a stricter approach to it. And that's why I prefer using the constructivist approach to analyze the situation, because it not only shows the normalization of human rights, which explains the growth and participation of African and Western states over time, but it also shows how they behave and why African states are normalizing a stricter approach or what African states are normalizing a softer approach while Western states are normalizing a more stricter approach to human rights. So my conclusion, as I just said, are although both perspectives analyze and give insights into this presented case study, I believe the constructivist perspective promotes a deeper understanding of the situation by addressing the norms behind state behavior that a realist perspective could discredit to just mere reflections of power. And that is my conclusion. A future research, I think, could look into the larger global implications of this research instead of just looking at African states. I think you could do Western and non-Western states and seeing if the argument still holds through. One future research that I really want to dig into is, okay, so now I feel like I can explain to some extent the behavior of states, but how does that relate to their human rights progress within their country? And then really switching the conversation, instead of looking at the behavior of the reviewing states, to look at the behavior of the reviewed states and their human rights conditions in their country. And that's where I believe I want this research to take off and to go to. If you have any other questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. And I look forward to any feedback that you could give. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations. Thank you.
Great job. Thank you very much. Ethan?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just getting my presentation up. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Hopefully that's visible now.
Yeah, we can all see it.
All right, great. Thank you. All right. So, hello, everyone. My name is Ethan Rotundi. Thank you very much for coming out, as I said earlier. I'd like to start by thanking the New York State Political Science Association and Dr. Eunice Sozin of Lemoyne College for giving me this opportunity. Greatly appreciate it. I'm a junior at Lemoyne College, studying political science with a concentration in pre-law. More recently, I've been interested in international relations and U.S. foreign policy. I also minor in psychology and statistics. So for my presentation, it is presidential primacy in United States foreign policy with a focus on America's policy towards Yemen and alliance with Saudi Arabia. So to start, I'm going to define what exactly primacy means. So the regular Webster Dictionary definition just says the fact of being primary, preeminent, or more important than. I think that is a very appropriate way to describe the dynamic between Congress and the president in recent years, especially in recent years, but going all the way back to the Roosevelt presidency in the 40s. So to start, oh, there we go. So to start, an overview. For decades, congressional oversight and responsibility of U.S. foreign policy has been ceded to the office of the president. This has been going on for decades, as I explicitly said before, case in point being the last time Congress declared war was World War II. However, there have been nearly 100 military actions taken by the United States since 1945, the end of World War II. And no region has seen more of these deployments in the Middle East, which I will get into now. So as for the emergence of presidential primacy over that of Congress, there are three main reasons which I outline: the transition of party politics, the delegation of congressional powers to the executive branch, and difference in the hierarchical structures between the two branches. So as for the transition of party politics, we have seen a shift in the way that both people think of the president and people think of political parties. Now we are much more used to seeing a party serving the will of the president rather than the president serving their own party, which is the way in which you would normally think of the president acting in best interest for the people and for the people that got them elected. FDR, again, is a perfect example of this, as he was very integral in getting the United States back on their feet after the Great Depression and leading them through the majority of World War II. However, he, as a president and as a person, was elevated to a near monarchical status. People idolized him, the party idolized him, and this is where we are, basically. Trump, the idea of Trump within the last 6 years, and more specifically the last 4, right? The idea of the Republicans preserving party unity was more important than ever, rather than admitting what the president was doing might have been right or wrong. So the most important reason here is the delegation of power between Congress and the executive branch. Congress has been ceding many powers to the office of the president, which has significantly weakened the power of Congress. I will get into more later, but some examples of this are the fact that at the height of the Trump presidency, there were over 36 active national emergencies at one time. Congress only voted on one of those. That's just one example. There's also the increased frequency and scope of executive decisions and how they are applied, and presidential negotiation of treaties and international deals without the support of Congress, getting into and pulling out of deals, which has been very common over the last 4 years, especially. And finally, the difference in hierarchical structure between the two branches. The two bodies of Congress must cooperate, or else it is very difficult to get anything done. Rather, compared to the executive branch, which operates on the will of the president. Legislation in Congress can get stuck very easily. So as a result, the president has a greater ability to expand its scope and its authority. The failure in Congress to pass legislation can severely damage congressional reputation of both the branch as a whole and also of the senators and congressmen and women. This leads to voters losing faith in their officials and instead putting faith in the president to sign or pass executive orders. Compared to how if a president fails to pass legislation, they can propose more and veto new bills that Congress brings to the floor, which is not easy to override, as we will explain later. So now we get into the US involvement in the Middle East. The United States has been involved in the Middle East since the 1980s when Marines went to stabilize and protect against Syrian influences in Lebanon. For the last 4 decades, the United States has been directly involved in numerous conflicts, most notably that of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen. An example is that 1.9 million soldiers were deployed during Operation Iraqi Freedom to Iraq and Afghanistan. Now we get into Yemen and the United States' relations with the country. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the United States and Saudi Arabia worked together to fight al-Qaeda cells throughout the area. The United States Presidents Bush and President Obama worked with then President Ali Abdullah Saleh, the first president since the country's unification in the spring of 1990, to fight the terrorist insurgencies in the area. However, as we know, this didn't go well and ended up culminating with drone strikes under the Obama administration. Under President Obama, 180 drone strikes were issued targeted in Yemen, culminating in over 1,300 casualties, including 3 United States citizens who were in the area. So more on United States-Yemen relations. Throughout the history of the countries working together, the United States and Yemen continued to fight ISIS cells throughout the country and al-Qaeda cells as well earlier on. So in 2004, the Houthi Revolution, which is an Islamic and political military movement, sprung up throughout the north of the country. Insurgencies raged and the Yemen National Forces and government in many cities to the north. The United States and Saudi Arabia worked to get those back in control of the Yemeni government, and eventually that was successful. However, by 2010, the Houthi movement had spread to the southern part of the country for the ports. By 2009, a missile strike on an al-Qaeda camp struck civilian towns, instead killing 60 Yemeni citizens, over 20 being children, which significantly hindered support for both President Saleh and President Obama. By May of 2012, Abroda Mansour Hadi, Saleh's vice president at the time, assumed the presidency after calls for Saleh to step down. But in 2015, the Hadi government eventually dissolved after insurgencies continued to pop up across the country, both in the north and south. In 2018, however, former President Saleh was able to reestablish the government in the south, but was killed in 2018. The fighting still rages on there to this day. Now we get into the actual part of my paper, the substantive part of my paper, which is Joint Resolution number 7, put forth by Senators Sanders, Murphy, and Lee. The idea behind SJ Res 7 is to repeal the 2002 action, which funded a war against Hussein in Iraq, which both Bush and Obama used as a shield to continue military efforts in Iraq and Syria. The resolution would also allow the United States to distance themselves from the conflict through removal of U.S. armed forces from Yemen and a congressional submission of reports assessing consequences of United States Saudi withdrawal from the country of Yemen. It was introduced and passed in the Senate by a vote of 54 to 46, passed in the House, but vetoed by President Trump when it needed to his office. The Senate failed to override the veto by a vote of 53 to 45, which is unfortunate to say the least. However, in a separate action, the 2002 action, which funded war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq and continued funding Middle Eastern conflict, was repealed on its own. So the implication for this are very, very significant. This is an attempt of Congress to exercise its own power over foreign policy, which is denigrated to them within the Constitution. However, it's another example, again, of a president using his own authority to veto Congress and therefore veto the will of the people. This little cartoon down here kind of represents that. It's another case in point is the War Powers Act of 1973, which was a congressional attempt to gain some control over the president's military actions abroad, but has become sort of a laughingstock at this point, as it does not really pertain to, again, military action abroad, as Congress has not declared war since 1945. Now we get into Saudi relations with the United States and war crimes. Throughout their time in Yemen, Saudi Arabia has used very many attacks in various ways, including airstrikes and small arms fire directed at civilians and insurgents alike. There's really no distinction between the two, as well as the murder, torture, inhumane treatment, and enlistment of child soldiers in the region throughout their fight. The United States continuing to back Saudi Arabia instead of calling them out and selling them weapons again, which I will discuss later, is significant because it severely hinders United States credibility overseas, and it's a bad look for a country that prides itself on democracy and freedom. Since then, the United States Defense Department has claimed that U.S. involvement in Yemen saved lives. Clearly, Congress does not agree with this, as they have voted to end weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, and the proposal of Joint Resolution 7 showcases that. However, twice Trump has vetoed the ban on weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and vetoed the resolution to withdraw United States support from military support from Yemen. Most recently, the murder of the U.S. journalist Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudis and war crimes in Yemen were a key issue of concern for whether or not Saudi Arabia would be condemned for their actions. Now we look at what can actually be done about this. The Senate has tried numerous times, as I just noted.
Just to let you know, you have 2 minutes. Just
Great, thank you. Senate has tried numerous times, as I just noted, to remove their forces and exercise some control over the scope of United States foreign policy. Well, one, try again. You need to keep the pressure up if you ever want anything to change, right? That goes to show for anything, right? Next, Congress is often talked about as having power of the purse. That is a very important power that Congress has. They were able to end the war in Vietnam after years of fighting because they stopped funding it. Since they repealed that resolution from 2002, which funded the United States military operation in Iraq, they can also vote to fund or defund the military insurgencies in Yemen. They can effectively utilize their constitutional rights and ingrained powers, such as proposal of substantive and procedural legislation, procedural being the rules of the procedures and how they're conducted, and the substantive powers being policy specific, such as the Marshall Plan and defense budget that they spend every year. And they can use political capital to sway public opinion. There's an interesting study done in 2016-17 by British Journal of Politics and International Relations that showed that support significantly wanes for a president when Congress calls them out on their actions, and even more so when the mention of the Constitution is brought up and a president's actions being unconstitutional. What we do know is that more than 8,000 civilians are dead, another 9,500 and more are injured, and 3.3 million people are currently displaced. The State Department has approved at least $30.1 billion more to the Saudi military contract, combining to be $109.3 billion in total, while only spending $3.4 billion in aid since the humanitarian crisis in Yemen began. If we want things to get better, we need to provide more money to the people that we are effectively killing, as well as stopping the sale of weapons and contracts to those that are killing them. It's becoming more than just a war at this point. It is a humanitarian crisis, and it is also an ethical question of the morals and what the United States holds valuable. Thank you very much.
great job. All 5 presentations and papers were excellent. If the other panelists could just turn on their cameras while we go through the comments that I'll provide. So what is typical for those watching who may not have attended academic conferences in the past, typically after presenters on the panel present their papers and research, there's usually a discussant who then provides comments and feedback, which I'll do now. So I'll start first with our first presenter, Gabriel, who talked about geography of hunger and refugee security dilemmas. I really thought your paper was really, hold on, some people want to be admitted. I thought your paper was excellent. Of all the 5 papers, I guess food security and these types of issues in IR, an area that I don't focus on too much in my own work. So I really learned a lot in reading your paper about really how just really how difficult and but also how problematic and really sad this type of situation is in international affairs. And I really think you make some excellent points in your work, especially the vicious cycle that we see. I think my favorite part of your presentation was where you actually map out the geography of hunger. And so one of my first points of feedback for you is to put that slide in your actual paper, because I think it allows the reader to see just exactly how this geography of hunger operates. And I think that would give your paper a lot more gravitas, but I think it would also tie a lot of what you were saying, a lot of the theoretical and empirical concerns that you raised in your paper. I think it would be great to bring those all together. I also thought your work was theoretically rich. I thought it was interesting that you sort of utilize this geography of hunger research. It's a little dated in the sense that it's something that was published in the 60s, but it's been very popular, and I'm glad that you were able to sort of bring it forward to the 21st century and apply it to a lot of the stuff that we're seeing. I thought that was really good. In your paper, you didn't talk about it too much in your presentation. I really like your connection to this idea of the security dilemma. So the way you connected a lot of this to Barry Buzan's research. I'd like to see you in your paper develop that a little bit more, because I really thought it was fascinating. But as I was reading your paper, I kept waiting for you to sort of bring it back in at the end, and it didn't come back in. So I want to see you develop that more. I thought that was one of the best parts of your paper. In terms of thinking about your paper, in terms of other areas where you can improve, I think one area where you might have for your paper is kind of consider a single case. In other words, a situation, a country that you're studying where you can actually look at, kind of dive deeply. Your use of the statistics and the data are very good, and I like that. But the problem is with what you're studying, we really need some depth to this geography of hunger. And I think the only way you can do that is through a case study. So not just using geography as your case, but picking one of those countries on one of those maps that you showed us and sort of exploring some of these dynamics that you talk about. Like, for example, if you were to do this as a PhD dissertation, right, an opportunity for you to do field work, to go to one of these countries, right, conduct interviews with refugees, get your feet on the ground and see some of these dynamics, I think would, if that's your route or you plan to do that, right, that would give your, that would provide your paper with lots of data. But you could do a case study, right, simply using secondary sources, media reports. You could even conduct interviews with people on the ground who are doing work in terms of relief work in these places, and figure out some of the challenges and issues that they're facing, and try to incorporate that. I think the statistics are interesting, but I don't think they do enough to provide that empirical foundation for the theory that you develop. I think you do a great job of highlighting there's a problem, but I want to see more to that problem. I want to sort of understand the dynamics of that problem. The other thing is sort of think about climate change, for example. What are some of those other issues that are impacting refugee movement? You talk in your paper about how food security not only can create violence, but violence can create food insecurity. But there are other issues that can create food insecurity too. You might look at some of the literature on state capacity, right? Why do we have these issues of food insecurity, right? Because you have an international community that's not providing enough donation, but you also have states in which these migrants are fleeing to that were really not very stable to begin with. And I think you see a lot of that in international relations. So I think your paper did a really excellent job of highlighting some of these complexities, and it is a very complex problem, and there's lots of moving parts. And I think doing a case study, or maybe a couple of case studies on particular issues, particular countries in particular, where you see, right, this insecurity at work, would provide a lot of support for some of the theoretical developments in your paper. Really nice job. Let's see, who was the second? Jessica. So Jessica, I really liked your paper. Actually, in my foreign policy class, I just taught climate change. So it was really interesting to read your paper and sort of see some of the issues at the domestic level in US politics, right? How the court system is being used, some of the lawfare that's taking place in order to sort of push climate change out there. Your paper, I mean, obviously the people in the audience haven't read it, and I'm sure some of your fellow panelists haven't, but you did a really remarkable job of sort of outlining all the legal issues that you addressed. When I first started reading your paper, I was kind of apprehensive because I don't do a lot of work in domestic law, but you really did such an amazing job of spelling everything out and explaining the complexity and your discussion of the cases. You just did a really amazing job in doing that. And I was really impressed with how you were able to not only explain that, but tell it in a compelling way. And I think, I think that's something to be proud of. So I was really impressed with that. Your paper does a magnificent job as well of highlighting, I think, the failure of the federal government to address this in a really rigorous way. And so, it's and kind of connects to Javier's paper, right? When you have these opportunities, right, these political opportunities, right, activists have to find other ways to get what they want. And, obviously, I would hope that we don't see violence in terms of pushing for climate change, but obviously the use of the federal court system and state court systems to sort of push these agendas is not uncommon in US politics. We've seen it in the civil rights movement in particular. And it's really fascinating to see that this similar dynamics are developing in the areas of climate change. So I thought that was really fascinating that you pointed that out. And so I'd like to see you develop that a little bit more, as definitely as cases come to the fore. So one area that I think that your paper needs a little bit more stronger development is a discussion of the environmental impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. So you talk about it in the presentation about sort of the per capita pollution, right? Per capita, the US pollutes more than any country in the world. But in absolute terms, right, China, the pollution from China is much more significant. Another thing is that I think that well, fossil fuels, I think, are a big deal in terms of climate change. For the United States, also the use of cars is a big problem. If you look at, and in the paper that I'll send you back, I'll send you a website where you can look at how pollution is spread out across both countries. In China, the pollution is very concentrated in the northeastern section of the country. In the United States, the levels of pollution are lower, but they cover the entirety of the continental United States. So this would lead me to believe that it's not necessarily energy generation or fossil fuels in that sense, but more of just the everyday pollution that individuals are emitting through just running power in their home, but also in the use of cars as well. And so I think the fossil fuel industry is a problem, but I think the automobile industry is a problem as well. And that might be something that you explain a little bit more clearly in your paper. If you look at the usage of cars in China, for example, it's 80 cars per 1,000 residents, whereas in the US, it's 800. So it's 10 times. There are 10 times more cars being driven in the United States than there are in China, which is, and again, somewhat odd given that, the population in China is about 3.5, 4 times larger than that of the United States. So I think that's something to consider as well. You might also look at some of the regulatory aspects of your argument. So there's a lot of laws that have already been passed that allow the federal government to combat and regulate climate change. So the EPA, for example, could do a lot more through various acts, various legislation that's already been passed, right? So there's a political issue going on, right, where, right, you see the EPA in some administrations being very aggressive and others being not so aggressive. So I think that's something that you should consider in your paper as well. One area that I think that you might want to go back to is sort of look at the issue of policymaking, because I think the courts as policymakers is a very contentious topic, not only in legal studies, but in the study of US politics. Right, as conservatives especially are very much against the courts being policymakers. And I think this is a very contentious aspect. And I think in your paper, I thought this is one of the most compelling and interesting aspects of your argument. And I'd like to see you develop that even further as you work on your research. So really nice job. I really enjoyed reading your paper. Yeah. Javier, really amazing study on the Christian identity movement. Just really excellent. I think the level of research in your paper was really quite engaging. And I liked how you kind of connected a lot of different strands in the political science literature, as well as in the study of political violence, especially. I think you did a good job of profiling the sort of issue in terrorism that I think has only become more important since the events of January 6th. I really liked in your paper how you connected this identity movement to the political movements in the 1970s, right? Really, once Ronald Reagan became president in the 80s, right, where this conservative religious movement really becomes a driver of U.S. politics, but also begins to dominate U.S. politics, especially the Republican Party. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought also one of the things I liked about your paper is that you sort of flipped the script on our understanding of terrorism. I think it's all too convenient to look at terrorism as involving a particular faith, involving people who practice Islam or Muslim. And I think terrorism is committed by a range of individuals. And I really liked how your paper looked at a different group, but also a group that really presents a greater threat to US security and to US citizens than many of these Islamic groups that are often vilified, not only in the media, but our own politicians. For your paper, one of the areas that I think that what I think would have made your paper stronger would have been a better discussion of the landscape of these different groups. In other words, it would have been nice to see just how many of these Christian identity groups are there within the movement, and sort of understanding how these different groups that operate in these various movements differ from one another. I think you did an excellent job of profiling the Christian identity movement, but there's from your paper, there's a multitude of groups, and you mentioned a few. But I think your paper would be served by having some sort of chart or visual that mapped out these different groups, as well as groups that may reside in one or more different categories. I think that would have been helpful for your paper. Another concern I had with your paper, and I'll go into it more deeply within the comments when I send you the comments later, is I felt that your paper needed a more explicit argument. And I think that you introduced that argument, but I think it needs to be clearer to the reader. So on I think it's page 6, where you talk about, right, these additional reasons for looking at the Christian identity movement as a potential case study of insurgency stems from the substantive influence on the ideological and organizational development of the American far right. I think that's a really compelling argument. I think it's very bold, but I think you're probably correct. But I want to see that introduced earlier in your paper. Because I think it would allow you to sort of test this will means opportunity lens that you've developed. I think your paper would also benefit for some theory development of your own. And this applies to all 5 of you. As you think theoretically about these issues, rather than relying on theories developed by others, right, maybe take a pass at developing your own theory to understand the research questions that you're studying. And so for your paper, Javier, I think you would benefit, because you've done such a deep dive and understanding of these groups. I think you would benefit a lot from perhaps developing your own lens through which to better understand these Christian identity groups. Another area, and I'll end with this feedback, is perhaps look more comparatively at right-wing terrorism, right? Perhaps look at Christian identity movements. Do we see these movements develop in other countries? I think in your presentation, you mentioned towards the end, you mentioned a couple of other countries, but it might be interesting in a paper to perhaps draw in some examples from other places so that we can see how these groups operate and develop. Because that might help us to understand better how these groups are operating in the United States. So very excellent paper. I really enjoyed reading it. Let's see. Oh yeah, you submitted it on PDF. So Dorian, I really liked your paper. I enjoyed the theory that you developed. Let me just get to the comments. Sorry, they're at the end of your paper. As a piece of empirical research, I think you did a really excellent job of using two IR theories to sort of understand this progression of human rights at the UN. I think your proposal raised some interesting questions about how Western and African states sort of approach these periodic reviews. I think that says a lot about how different states within the UN not only approach human rights, but how they operate in the United Nations. And I think your paper does a good job at highlighting that we see this variation and how can we understand this variation. It was interesting that in your when you at the end when you sort of said, well, maybe realism isn't the right lens to look at. In my comments to you, that was actually one of my criticisms as well, is that I think realism, because realists don't really talk about human rights, and a lot of realist research focuses on really great power politics. So a lot of this, what you're studying, I think falls outside of great power politics. And so like I mentioned with Javier, I would encourage you to, rather than use these grand IR theories, to perhaps take a step back from your ideas and sort of develop a theory of your own that best explains why we see this variation. Because I think that would help you to move away from the assumptions of both of these theories, realism and constructivism, to perhaps develop a more satisfying answer to why why we're seeing what we're seeing. Another concern I had with your paper, and it's not an issue, you probably have it, but I was really interested in seeing some of the actual data that you collected. In other words, you provide these categorization, but I was very concerned, I was very confused at some points about what exactly constituted a soft recommendation and what constituted a hard recommendation. So the actual data that you collect that allows you to code what's soft and what's hard, I think needs to be in the paper, right? Either as an appendix or discussed in some detail, right? So that your reader has a sense of how can they replicate, right, your methodology. And I think for all research done in the social sciences, you should keep in mind, how can others replicate your findings? In other words, someone should be able to take your theory and be able to, and how you do your research, and be able to conduct similar research and get similar answers to the questions that you're asking. And I think that's really important in your paper, especially Dorian, that you kind of bring in some of that methodology, perhaps explaining it a little bit more clearly and bringing that in. I also think that your paper would benefit from some alternative explanations. So this is very common in social science research, where you present your research question, you present your theory and your answer or your finding, but also introduce alternative explanations that compete with your theories, the theories that you're developing. And I think that these alternative explanations can often provide support to your argument and actually make your argument stronger. In your case, Dorian, I think what you might want to consider is sort of, how do these African countries see human rights? Is there a different discourse on human rights within the Western world versus, say, in these African countries? Is there a respect for human rights, and how can we measure this? And does this respect vary across regions and across countries? And also, we need to see some empirical evidence of these differences in interpretation of what human rights are. Another alternative explanation for your findings is that there might be foreign policy implications to talking down to your neighbor, right? So in other words, the Western countries may be more reliant on each other for trade or security or other foreign policy concern. And so they may take a softer approach, right? Because they have much more to lose than, say, a country like the US or France does, in terms of talking more forcefully about human rights towards these African countries. Let's see. Another, and the last point is, I think that you need to consider the newness of the Human Rights Council. So just for those who aren't aware, it didn't come into being until 2006. So your first review that you study happens in 2008. So I think an interesting thing that you might want to consider in your research is the norms that developed in human rights in the UN from other human rights organs and bodies, right? Did those norms transfer to the HRC, right? Did that occur? My guess is it probably didn't. And I think that might explain why, right, in 2008, you see a more tentative approach to human rights than you do in 2008. So I think you should consider, right, the newness of this UN body in advocating for human rights. That might be a competing explanation for why you see the variation that you see. And I think that's something important to consider in your research. So really great job. I really enjoyed reading your paper. And then, hold on. Ethan, I really enjoyed your paper as well. Your paper is fascinating because in papers that I'm trying to get published now, I look at some of the same questions that you look at in terms of understanding. But as my case study, I use the War Powers Resolution. And so I think your paper is very fascinating. I think definitely your paper highlights an important issue in sort of how the US and how the US president and Congress sort of tussle and fight over foreign policy in the United States. And I think since, I think since President Trump, since we've seen the US sort of step back a little bit from international affairs, I think the topic of your paper, I think is a very important foreign policy issue to consider, but also it's important to consider the dynamics between the two branches of government and thinking about how those dynamics impact foreign policy. I think your paper needs just a little bit greater justification about why you chose Yemen as a case study. And so in all of your papers, it's very important to sort of justify, right, the universe of cases that exist out there. And so, for example, right, the Congress stepping in and putting a brake on presidential power on foreign policy is what we would consider a rare event. There aren't many instances, I don't think, of this happening. The Iran-Contra affair is another example where Congress made it illegal for the Reagan administration to provide financial support to the Contras, who were a right-wing paramilitary group operating in Central America. And so the only way that the Reagan administration could get funding to the Contras was by this complex scheme of selling military equipment to Iran and then funneling that money to the Contras. So here you see an instance where, right, the Contra scandal or Congress stepping in and saying no more money to these paramilitary organizations in Central America, right, led to this very tragic affair that really ended up with a number of U.S. officials going on trial and really tarnishing the last term of President Ronald Reagan. So I think for your paper in the beginning, sort of map out other instances where we see we see Congress taking a very dramatic role in putting a stop on presidential power. I think one of the great things about your paper that I enjoyed was I really loved your use of primary source material. And so you really get into the weeds by not just looking at newspaper articles in other academic sources, but you really look at the congressional records and you really get into the weeds and understanding, what's going on in both Congress and the executive branch. So I thought that was really fascinating. Another area that you might want to consider is doing perhaps a cross-case comparison. In other words, highlighting the issues happening with Yemen are interesting, but how does that congressional executive branch dynamic compare to other dynamics? Perhaps looking at the war power resolution, perhaps looking at the Iran Contra issue, right? I think there's a lot going on in U.S. foreign policy where you see Congress and the presidency sort of come together. Syria could be a good example. When President Obama wanted to do something in Syria, and at one point in his term, Congress said no, and then the executive branch didn't really do it, right? So there's some examples where Congress steps in and they fail, but there are examples where Congress steps in and they succeed. And so I think having a better understanding of at what point does Congress succeed and at what point does Congress fail, I think that would be a really excellent addition to your paper. Let's see. Yep. And now I have, excellent job, Ethan. I really enjoyed all of your papers, and I have comments and further comments, and I'll email those to all of you later today. There's some questions, so let me look at them. So this question's for Dorian, it's in the chat. So a question from someone in the audience, from Catherine. She's actually a student of mine in my course. So her question is about whether or not looking at neoliberal institutionalism might provide another useful lens. Did you want to respond to that, Dorian?
Yeah, I'll briefly reply. I think that, thank you so much for your question, Catherine. As the chair, as Keith has talked about, like, opening up into more lenses that I can look at to try to explain what's going on in the Universal Periodic Review. I don't know too entirely much about neoliberal institutionalism. I'd have to refresh in my brain, but it's definitely a perspective I'm open to looking more into and trying to explain that. So thank you so much for raising the question.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Neoliberal institutionalism was designed mainly to look at the economic side of international relations. Although neoliberal institutionalists would probably say that they were looking at all facets of IR or all facets of state behavior. So I would say definitely that you might find some better linkages and connections to your work by looking at some of the works of Robert Cohen. I can send you some suggestions when I send you my comments. Good question. Another one is for Ethan. It's from Hatet, and he is curious about the transition period between new administration. Should the legislative branch be a part of that transition when it comes to foreign policy? Do you have any thoughts on that, Ethan?
Yeah, actually, I think that's very interesting, just as a question in general. So thank you very much for that. I think that it's difficult to say, honestly, because you have a lot of differences in foreign policy when the executive branch changes over from president to president, but you also have a lot of differencing opinions and perspectives when Congress changes into new session and new congressmen and women are elected. So I think it's kind of hard to say, at least from where I'm sitting right now, but I do believe that the legislative branch should be involved in that transition and should work hand in hand with each president as like sort of a collective to get things done, I guess would be how I respond to that.
Good response. Jeffrey, could you just type your question in the chat? It'll be easier. Being able to talk is locked out, except for the panelists. There's a question here from Fernanda for Gabrielle. She asks, what could international organizations or countries do to help reduce hunger?
I think the first step is financial, as the World Food Program explained it the best. The best way to help until they don't have the vaccine, for example, due to the coronavirus, is the financial of food. But is a direct link between the countries and the international organization. So they need the financial for these states. And the best way to reduce this hunger is through financial or donations, private or non-private donations.
Good question.
Thanks a lot for asking.
I would say another piece of feedback that I had in your paper was it might be useful also in your paper to talk about how international organizations in perhaps more detail, and countries as well, can help ameliorate some of those food security issues that you highlight in your paper. Because I think, for refugees in particular who are, between states, right, who advocates for them really except for international organizations? There's really no, when their own state is not able to support them, who's left but these international organizations? And I think that's a really great question from Fernanda, and also something that you might want to consider in your paper as you work on it. Great job. Did you have a question, Jeffrey? I know you raised your hand before. Oh, this question's for Javier. Jeffrey asked, could you broadly discuss the link between the American Christian identity movement under different Republican presidents? Do we see a difference between Reagan and Trump, for example?
All right, now I'm unmuted. So the difficulty with distinguishing between what is uniquely Christian identity and their connections between various affiliate groups is, as of now, the movement is really highly fractionalized. If you look at the organic pastoral communities, because you have one pastor over here that's like, I'm like the chosen one, and then you have another pastor down in other Timbuktu part of the country saying, no, I'm the chosen one. So it's hard to say how the movement itself from its organic capacity has really grown as a thread. I mean, movements have obviously changed. I mean, specific pastoral communities have obviously changed over the past 20 years. Good source to look at it would be the SPLC hate map. They actually have identifiers where you can actually track the changes in distribution of Christian identity churches across. But in terms of, how embedded are they within the militia movement, at least the second wave of the militia movement that we've seen since 2008. I mean, that requires in-depth narrative analysis to compare, all right, how many groups perceive the Jewish populations to be the same as how identity has long perceived to be the Jewish populations. Also considering the fact that identity has been very fluid in how accommodating it's been in order to expand its following, in order to increase its claim that no, we're a prominent ideological pillar within the far right, while also accounting for the fact that that claim may be substantiated. So in terms of the difference between Reagan and Trump, I mean, I would argue that the identity movement, at least under Reagan, was more profound as a distinct community, simply because during Reagan, you had the Order, which began in '83, I believe, under Louis Beam, who was an identity adherent. And like, for example, Michael Barkun's Religion and the Racist, right, actually talks about the Order as a pseudo-Christian identity organization. It was also white nationalist and white power, but nevertheless, Christian identity was a strong influencer within that movement. In terms of Trump, I mean, I know there were, in a recent analysis by Ari Perliger, where he discusses the resurgence of the militia movement since 2008, there are some mentions of the Christian identity and some organizations that were involved as of late, but yeah, I mean, it's just hard to, at least from what I've seen, just hard to distinguish. So I apologize if that's not a good answer, but it's hard.
I think the question is very good, and that might be something to consider in your paper too, as you move forward with your research about how connected or disconnected are these movements from the the elite in power, either, and not just through the president either, but also through members of Congress, or even at the state level as well. That might be something to look at and consider in your work. Good. I had a question for Jessica. I was wondering if you could just maybe talk to for just a couple, just for a few seconds about how likely do you think that the courts will be able to sort of deliver on some of these issues that activists are seeking to get through the courts? Do you think this is something that we're going to see happen, or is this more of a pipe dream? What do you think about that?
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, at this stage, I think it would be more of a pipe dream, just because I know we talked about how reluctant the courts are in policymaking and how it's such a contentious subject, and the courts really want to stay away from that political questions doctrine. They don't want to step on the toes of the other branches. And I've spoken with some environmental attorneys about my project, and they all say the same thing, like, we all want this to happen. And I think that the arguments are very strong. I think the Juliana case is very strong, and I would love to see for that to go to the Supreme Court and for them to issue a ruling on that. But as of right now, I don't see it happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the interesting things about your paper was just there's just so many avenues to. It's very hard to get to the Supreme Court, but there's so many avenues to get there that I think it's just a matter of time before we see something in the court system. So really great. We've sort of gone over our time a little bit, so I just want to thank everyone, all the audience members for sticking around, and also for all the great questions to the panelists, as well as the amazing work that all 5 of you did in terms of your research, but also in really raising awareness and talking about real issues in not just US politics, but also international politics, climate change, hunger, terrorism, human rights. I think these are all really, really fascinating topics, but I also think a lot of the research that you do can really, really help and benefit society in a number of ways. So I'm really impressed with your efforts, and I wish you all the best of luck in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for coming, and thank you for participating.
Thank you so much.